This video is brought to you by viewers like you. Thanks for letting me do this for so long. When you think a little too hard about video games, they all start to follow the same basic patterns. A protagonist needs obstacles to overcome so they can grow as a character, and when you're playing a video game, the easiest and most obvious roadblocks that have been used time and time again are boss fights. The very existence of boss fights in your game is predictable because that's how video games have worked for decades, but that's where the hope of unpredictability swings in to save the day. Inject some chaos into established conventions and suddenly you're in a boss fight against a slot machine or singing feces or whatever this is supposed to be. Boss fights that genuinely surprise me with their timing or their premise or how you fight them are a rare commodity, but you better believe that it's worth talking about in a video because great surprises give me so much life. Specifically, this is a video about bosses that I never expected to fight, which may have some intersection with some other videos I've made in the past, but trust me, it's different somehow. One of my videos being made up on the spot. How expected. There's actually a dozen or so metrics by which you can describe a boss fight as unexpected, and when I ask people, a lot of people described bosses to me that had strange designs to them, and apart from the fact that I think I've already made that video before, more so I'm going to be dealing with bosses today featuring characters who I never expected to be fighting. You know, that's maybe a more accurate title than what I've got at the moment, but I think YouTube likes what I have now. And I need all the help I can get. A lot of this video will be about the balancing act of expectations up against reality. That's basically how something ends up being unexpected. You're anticipating one thing, and then the game's like, whoa, how about this instead? Lots of games do this, but not all of them come with any kind of strong expectations, but if that's our requirement, then we absolutely have to get the Final Fantasy VII Remake involved, because you'd have to go quite far to find a game with higher expectations than this thing. So many people have incredibly fond memories of the original, which means that there was always a lot of pressure on Square to not fuck this up, and yeah, they did well. They tweaked a lot of things to suit the genre shift without losing the essence of Final Fantasy VII, and it showed that Square really did care about the game they were adapting. How much they cared came into very sharp focus when you reached the end of Corneo's Colosseum, where you're promised some kind of incredible climactic battle with something amazing, and it's a house. No, you heathen, this is Hell House. There's a clear distinction, I can't believe you didn't notice that. So Hell House is a fun boss fight in its own right that speaks to the more ridiculous side of Final Fantasy VII, but anyone who played the original for more than a few hours will be able to tell you that the Hell House has some quirky history behind it. It's not a boss in this game, it's actually just a random enemy in Sector 6 that hides in a house but actually has a bunch of robot arms for doing some damage. The thing is though, that while it matches the thought that Japanese developers like putting weird things in their games sometimes, Hell House is one of the most memorable enemies in this game because it's one of the strangest. This makes the Hell House boss fight in the remake such a surprise, the kind of glow up that no one could have expected, but it shows that Square were making this remake with a huge amount of love and respect for the original. The remake isn't suddenly terrible about Hell House showing up out of nowhere as a fully fledged boss fight, but it's such an awesome callback to one of the weirdest details from Final Fantasy VII. And hey, this is just episode 1 of the remake, who knows what's coming up later? My money's on the slap fight. You know what franchise is really hard to predict? Kingdom Hearts is always open to fan interpretations over where things are going and what they really mean, but that just makes it all the more fun when the devs decide to give the wheel a spin and see where we end up, especially when it comes to boss fights. Kingdom Hearts is kinda wonderful with boss fights since the overlap between the super serious original characters and the Disney characters is often reflected in some massively varied battles with all sorts of different opponents. It's not always good, but it is unpredictable, which puts me in a bit of a bind when it comes to picking out one that is more unexpected than the others, but thankfully, Kingdom Hearts 3 was more than willing to put the pieces in place for me. This game sees you visit Toy Box, which is a world full of Toy Story characters, and inevitably takes you to a toy shop, which, with Kingdom Hearts being aware of electronic toys like video games, features the in-game video game Verum Rex, which is such a big deal in Toy Box that it's got its own cartoon series and line of toys, and a playable mini-game demo thing. It's meant as one big nod to Tetsuya Nomura's Final Fantasy Versus 13, which of course never happened, but that's why main character Yozora looks so Final Fantasy-y. Seems like a waste of a character design for him to have such a brief role in the game, but don't be so hasty! The only thing I'd say against Yozora being a fun surprise in Kingdom Hearts 3's Remind DLC is that the base game's secret ending features Yozora heavily, and that's not really something you do with a character that you don't have plans for in the future. Still though, you need to remember that until the DLC, Yozora was little more than a background character with virtually no story significance, so for Kingdom Hearts 3 to upgrade his role to being a real person within the story and a lot more than the star of a video game is a pretty massive deal, and one that you can't really prepare for. Kingdom Hearts has a history of keeping some intensely memorable boss fights in reserve for the post-game, and so some DLC shouldn't be too surprising as a place where a surprise boss fight could exist, but I was definitely convinced that Yozora was just some side character. It says a lot to the weirdness of the whole setup that after fighting each other, both Yozora and Sora wonder if their fight was real or not. Or it was a scenario that the devs were dying to put together and can hide it behind potentially being a dream until they work out what they're doing. Best of both worlds that way. Super bosses are not unexpected. I mean, they kind of are, because not every game has them, but when a boss fight exists outside of the regular story, you can make certain allowances for some post-game challenges that do whatever the hell they want. I'm not so sure what a super boss would have to be like for it to be genuinely surprising, but we could do worse than turn to Pokemon for ideas, since most of those games have conventions that have been set in stone for decades. You wrestle some badges off some gym leaders, you slide your way through some Elite Four members, and then you dunk on the champion of the hour. It's uncomplicated, but a lot of fun to go through every time, especially since the games don't often end once you become champion. Gold and Silver had some roaming legendaries for you to catch, Johto had 8 more gym badges to earn, and Gen 2 had one last opponent left for you to overcome. It was a good generation for post-game, let's be honest. Fighting Red at the top of Mount Silver is perhaps one of the only truly unexpected super boss fights in all of gaming, because of the precedent it set going forward. Being able to fight the previous game's protagonist is pretty much the perfect ending for the Game Boy era Pokemon games, with so much fan service at a time when these games weren't so brazen with that. I mean, yeah, having the whole of Kanto as the post-game isn't exactly subtle, but I don't think most people would extrapolate meeting Red just from travelling to a neighbouring region. It's a hell of a challenge too, I suppose it has to be, as a super boss. But all these years later, and Red is still one of the strongest trainers in any Pokemon game, and his Pikachu is a higher level than the god of all creation. Kind of a big deal. Special mention has to go to Heart Gold and Soul Silver that naturally lose some surprise factor by virtue of being remakes, but make up for it by setting the battle against a spectacular snowy backdrop that really captures the spirit of what this fight is all about. I don't know what Pokemon has to do going forward to have something this powerful again, other than just throwing Red up a mountain again. Fool me twice, shame on me. Pokemon games have actually had quite a large number of incredibly strong trainers to fight in the post-game, but they're usually self-inserts from the developers or rematches with significant NPCs from the story. Gotta say though, Pokemon doesn't tend to carry one protagonist over from one game to the next but in a different capacity, so this is quite important. The situation has lots of gravity. Early boss fights are so incredibly crucial for both outlining the features of a video game, but also for setting the tone. It's an opportunity to explain to the player exactly how this game is going to handle things, and if your game is a bit different for whatever reason, this is the time to show it. Undertale is different to the point of requiring a character to show off all of its eccentricities, suitably called Toriel, who quite literally at points holds your hand and guides you through how combat works, and how you've got a lot more options than just attacking and defeating every creature you come across. It's a nice sequence after the hostility shown by Flowey moments earlier that does the same job of explaining how stuff works, but with a more optimistic view of the world. This optimism is challenged, however, towards the end of the area when Toriel stops you from leaving her care and venturing into the outside world by fighting you. Oh, not Goat Mum. It's a good way of doing things though, because Toriel's purpose in Undertale couldn't be more obvious as a way of showing you the ropes and explaining to you what makes Undertale so unique. From experience, you don't get much mileage out of the tutorial character beyond these opening moments, which is what makes her, as the first boss in the game, so surprising and so incredibly memorable.
I barely had any time at all to prepare.
Well, I suppose we do need to tap into the vast well of emotionally shocking boss fights out there. The way that the fight with Toriel is crafted is so impressive because her role as the tutorial character is to show you that you should probably try to negotiate with enemies and steer towards non-lethal solutions. And this works fine with standard enemies, and the area is large enough to give you plenty of practice with this, but Toriel is a completely different prospect because she functions like a boss with no clear path to pacifying her, and really you don't even know if you can solve this non-lethally the first time you play it. She seems fairly motivated to stopping you from leaving, and so what would you need to do in order to win? I think the main nugget of surprise for me is how hard Undertale goes so early. Between Flowey and Toriel, you get polar opposite viewpoints on how life works in this world, but unlike Flowey, who demonstrates his with his pellets and his scary face, Toriel puts herself in your way and fulfills her role as the tutorial character by giving you one last challenge to test your skills on. You've tried being friends with enemies, now you've got to work your magic on a boss fight with some pretty devastating consequences if you fail. I don't care who you are, no one was looking at Toriel guiding you through the spike traps thinking, yeah, I'm gonna end up fighting you. And if you did, there's a way of playing this game just for you. You'd fucking deserve it. If boss fights are the building blocks of most traditionally constructed video games, then The Legend of Zelda is one of the most traditionally constructed game franchises out there. Before Breath of the Wild came along and shook everything up, this selection of games was very set in its ways with a rigid formula that was followed pretty damn closely by virtually every game in the franchise. Some kind of adventure with dungeons where you find a new item that lets you complete the rest of the dungeon and is ultimately required to beat the boss at the end. Lather, rinse, repeat over and over again until you reach a point with Skyward Sword where this formula is so played out that it needed to be broken by first A Link Between Worlds and eventually Breath of the Wild 2. So when you play through the Skyview Temple at the start of Skyward Sword, you think to yourself, yeah, I know where this is going, got myself a beetle that flies around like a controllable boomerang, so probably a boss fight that makes the most out of that, maybe a giant spider that needs to be cut down from the ceiling or something, and then the main villain of the game shows up and just, the fuck you doing here? I know, the prospect of fighting Girahim at some point during Skyward Sword is the least unexpected thing imaginable considering all the marketing behind this game that painted him as a major player in this game, but I've played more than my share of Zelda games in the past, and generally the boss fight at the end of the first dungeon is some spider or insect or a giant choo-choo, not the main villain of the game. I know he revives Demise, and technically Demise is more important, but no, Girahim does the legwork, he's the main villain of the game, shut up. You're supposed to be eased into the idea of more challenging combat and introduced to how important items will be going forward. And yet we've got Skyward Sword here, throwing Girahim into the mix at the first opportunity as a way of practicing the sword combat and declaring that this ain't your granddad's Zelda. Looking back on it, it's shocking as hell that Nintendo would do this at the first opportunity. Like, imagine if Ocarina of Time had you fighting Ganondorf at the end of the Deku Tree. It's such a dramatic raising of the stakes that sets the stage for the adventure to come, but one that you can't really do again. Girahim works so well because he steals the show at an early stage with his flamboyant display, but also because his very existence as the first boss in the game flies in the face of a lot of what Zelda stands for. In this game that promoted one-to-one sword combat, the first boss fight is literally a one-on-one sword fight. I mean, come on now. Maybe they should put dehydrated Ganondorf as the first boss of Breath of the Wild 2? Might be a bit weird if he licks Link's ear though.
Skyward Sword is back on the menu again after the HD release came out on the Switch, and while it doesn't get everything right, the intrigue surrounding Girahim that very quickly becomes captivation at such an early stage is masterfully done. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe for more in the future, and there's also one right there that you can watch right now about the worst Nintendo games. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Sarah Malion, Joe Creamer, and Jerome Sankara. Thanks for watching, and Girahim deserved better, I think.